Picture this. It's 2 in the morning, roughly 1900 BCE, and you're walking barefoot across cool limestone into the inner courtyard of the Eanna temple complex in the city of Ur. The ziggurat rises behind you, 7 stories of mud brick and bitumen, about 21 meters tall, built by the king Ur-Nammu 2 centuries earlier, and still smelling faintly of tar in the heat. The air in the courtyard is thick with myrrh smoke and something sweeter, date wine, maybe lotus, maybe the residual perfume of the woman who walked through here an hour before you. They're singing, not hymns, something lower, more rhythmic, almost like breathing made audible, like a drumbeat played on the inside of a rib cage. A woman with coal-lined eyes and a linen wrap that catches the lamplight hands you a clay cup. The clay is rough against your palm, still warm from the kiln. You drink. It tastes of barley and honey, and something floral you can't name. The walls around you are carved with scenes your Sunday school teacher never mentioned. Figures intertwined, hands on hips, mouths open in song, or something else entirely. And here's the thing your textbook reduced to 1 bland paragraph, maybe 2 sentences if you got the longer edition. This temple wasn't a church. It wasn't a museum. It wasn't a quiet place where people folded their hands and whispered polite requests to the sky. It was a bank, holding grain deposits and silver loans. A hospital where priests set bones and mixed poultices. A university where scribes learned to press cuneiform into wet clay. A courtroom settling property disputes. A nightclub where the percussion didn't stop until dawn. A brothel, yes, in certain sacred contexts. And a portal to the divine, all operating simultaneously under one roof, staffed by hundreds of people on rotating shifts. And the wild part is often the actual historical record. We've just been trained not to look at it, not to squint, not to read the footnotes. So let's look. Start in Mesopotamia, 4,000 years ago, where the temple of Inanna at Uruk employed hundreds of women, not as silent prayer beads clutching rosaries in the dark, but as active participants in what scholars call hieros gamos, the sacred marriage. Once a year, usually in spring, around the month of Nisanu, the king would ritually unite with the high priestess, and the entire city treated this as agriculture. Not metaphor, not poetry dressed up as theology. Agriculture. The grain wouldn't grow if the divine couple didn't consummate. The irrigation canals wouldn't fill. The dates wouldn't ripen on their palms. We know this because the Sumerian hymns describing the ritual are explicit, poetic, and frankly gorgeous. They talk about honey on thighs, about the bed of cedarwood imported from the mountains of Lebanon, about the priestess choosing the king like a lioness chooses prey, about her sweet lap and his plow working the fertile ground. The poet Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, writing around 2300 BCE, composed hymns to Inanna that are among the oldest named literary works by any author, male or female, in human history. The British Museum has held these tablets since the 1850s, pulled from the rubble by Austin Henry Layard and his teams. For a century and a half, most popular translations just softened them, called it symbolic, called it probably metaphorical, called it a fertility allegory. It wasn't. The Turin erotic papyrus, dating around 1150 BCE, shows similar temple-adjacent imagery in Egypt with zero ambiguity. Someone carved it. Someone commissioned it, paid a craftsman's wage in grain and beer. Someone hung it on a wall where priests walked every single day on their way to morning offerings. Now move south to Egypt, specifically the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, built around 200 BCE under the Ptolemaic dynasty, though the sacred site itself is older by millennia, possibly back to the Old Kingdom, 2500 BCE. Hathor was the goddess of music, dance, intoxication, and yes, desire. Not as a footnote, as her primary portfolio. Her temple employed professional musicians, dancers, and what Egyptian records call the entertainers of the god, women whose role included ritualized sensuality as part of worship. The reliefs at Dendera, carved into sandstone columns, 14 of them, each with Hathor's cow-eared face staring out from the capital, show women in sheer linen so fine you can see the navel beneath, moving in choreographed sequences, accompanied by sistra and frame drums. And the thing modern visitors miss, standing there with their audio guides and sunscreen, is the sound. Scholars estimate these ceremonies involved dozens of women striking bronze sistra in overlapping polyrhythmic patterns, while drums kept a lower pulse underneath, a thrum you'd feel in your sternum before your ears registered it. It wasn't silent reverence. It was a concert. A 2,000-year-old concert where the bass line was your own heartbeat, and the lyrics were about the goddess's pleasure, her laughter, her unashamed wanting. The temple also functioned as a healing center. Patients slept in the outer courtyard, what Greeks later called the abaton, wrapped in linen, smelling of natron and other people's sickness, waiting for the goddess to appear in dreams and prescribe treatment. You'd wake up at dawn with sand in your hair, and a priest would read your dream like a doctor reads a chart. You saw the cow walking east. That's a liver complaint. Drink this. Crossed the Mediterranean to Greece, around 330 BCE. The sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, 700 meters above the Gulf of Corinth, wreathed in mist half the year. You've heard of the oracle. What you probably haven't heard is the geology. In 2001, a team including geologist Yella Zalinga de Boer and archaeologist John Hale published findings in the journal Geology, confirming that the temple sat directly over two intersecting fault lines releasing ethylene gas, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon that, in low doses, induces euphoria, altered speech, floating sensations, and trance states. The Pythia, the priestess delivering Apollo's prophecies, sat on a tripod over a chasm in the Adyton, the innermost room, breathing this gas from the fissure in the rock. She wasn't faking. She wasn't performing for tourists. She was chemically altered, her speech slurring, her body convulsing slightly, and the entire Greek world, kings, generals, merchants from Miletus to Syracuse, queued up for months, sometimes paying a premium called the promanteia to skip the line, just to hear her slur divine truth. And Corinth, 60 miles southeast, had the Temple of Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth, that flat-topped rock rising 500 meters above the city. By the 2nd century BCE, it reportedly employed over 1,000 sacred attendants. The geographer Strabo mentions them directly in his Geography, Book 8, Chapter 6. Whether sacred prostitution is the right term, or whether that's a later Christian projection onto a more complex system of temple service, dedicated women who performed ritual, managed temple finances, and, yes, engaged in sacred intimacy, is genuinely debated among modern scholars. But the economic footprint was real. The temple collected taxes on the trade, funded public works, maintained the harbor roads, and anchored the city's identity so thoroughly that to Corinthianize became a verb across the Mediterranean. Rome inherited all of this and made it louder, messier, more bureaucratic. The Lupercalia festival, celebrated every February 15th from the founding myth onward until Pope Gelasius banned it in 494 CE, that's nearly 1,000 years of continuous celebration, involved priests called Luperci, running naked through the streets of Rome, striking bystanders with strips of goat hide called februa. Women lined up for it, held out their hands. It was believed to grant fertility. Not abstract, spiritual, metaphorical fertility, the kind that produces a child 9 months later. The historian Plutarch describes it plainly in his Life of Caesar, and Ovid gets almost giddy describing it in The Fasti. Then there are the Vestal Virgins, 6 women, chosen between ages 6 and 10, sworn to 30 years of celibacy while tending Rome's sacred flame in the Forum. The flame could not go out. If it did, someone was beaten. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, the punishment was burial alive. Not execution, not the sword, burial. Placed in an underground chamber with a single oil lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a small cup of milk. Then sealed. The earth closed over her while she was still breathing. The last recorded case was under the Emperor Domitian, around 83 CE. And on the other end of the spectrum, the cult of Cybele, the Magna Mater, imported from Phrygia in 204 BCE during the Second Punic War, featured the Galli, priests who voluntarily castrated themselves with a sharp stone or a shard of pottery in a ritual frenzy called the Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood. They dressed in women's clothing, wore saffron-colored robes, applied makeup, grew their hair long, and served the goddess in what Roman sources describe with a mixture of fascination, mockery, and barely concealed horror. They were, by any modern reading, a recognized third-gender religious class. Rome tolerated them, regulated them, and kept them on the books for 5 centuries. Jump forward and east. India, around 950 CE. The temples at Khajuraho, built by the Chandela dynasty over roughly 200 years, between 950 and 1050 CE, originally 85 temples, 25 survive. The exterior walls of the Kandariya Mahadeva temple alone are carved with over 600 figures in every configuration of human intimacy you can imagine, and several you can't. Intertwined bodies, arched spines, hands gripping hips, mouths open. This isn't hidden in a back room. It's the outside wall. You see it walking up the path. Children saw it walking up. Farmers saw it on their way to market. The interior, by contrast, holds the deity in austere, lamp-lit silence. The architectural argument is deliberate and unmistakable. You walk through all of human experience: desire, play, violence, tenderness, absurdity, the comic and the grotesque, and only then enter the stillness of the divine. Meanwhile, the Devadasi system, documented in Chola dynasty copperplate inscriptions from the 10th and 11th centuries, dedicated women to temple service as dancers, musicians, and ritual participants. They owned property. They inherited land. They performed at festivals and received royal patronage. They were not, originally, what the British later made them. And that's the knife twist. In 1857, the East India Company's administrators began cataloging Indian temples for the Archaeological Survey. By the 1890s, colonial officers were publishing reports calling the carvings obscene, and the Devadasi system prostitution dressed in religion. In 1923, the Madras legislature passed the first Devadasi Act. By 1947, the system was legally abolished. The British did not study these traditions. They diagnosed them. They held them up to a Victorian mirror, didn't like the reflection, and legislated them out of existence. across the Atlantic. The Maya temple complexes at Tikal and Palenque, thriving between 250 and 900 CE. At Tikal, Temple 1 rises 47 meters above the jungle canopy, limestone blocks hauled without wheels or draft animals. Inside these pyramid temples, priests performed bloodletting rituals, piercing their own tongues, ears, and forearms with obsidian blades and stingray spines, threading knotted ropes through the wounds to offer vitality to the gods. The Yakchilan Lintel 24, carved around 725 CE, shows Lady Shok pulling a thorned rope through her tongue, blood dripping onto paper in a bowl below, her face serene, focused, almost meditative. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Maya books, details these ceremonies, alongside astronomical tables tracking Venus to an accuracy of 2 hours over 5 centuries. And the ball courts. 17 have been found at Chichen Itza alone. The largest, measuring 166 meters long, were not sports arenas in any modern sense. They were cosmological theaters, with a movement of the rubber ball about the size of a human head, heavy, dense, bouncing off angled stone walls, reenacted the journey of the sun through the underworld. The losing team's captain, in some periods and some city-states, was ritually killed. Not punished, not humiliated, sacrificed, honored. His death fed the same cycle the temple's inner rituals sustained. When the Spanish arrived in the 1520s, Bishop Diego de Landa, working in Yucatan in July 1562, burned nearly every Maya manuscript he could find. 4 survived, 4 out of thousands. He called it removing idolatry. The Maya called it erasure. They were right. And here's the pattern, the one that emerges when you lay Ur next to Dendera, next to Delphi, next to Khajuraho, next to Tikal. When you spread 5 continents and 3,000 years across one table and step back. Temples were never just one thing. They were the entire compressed experience of being a person in a civilization. Birth, healing, intoxication, desire, death, economics, law, music, altered states, grief, and, yes, the erotic, all braided together under the banner of the sacred. There was no separation between the body and the spirit, no wall between the market stall and the altar, no anxious sense that pleasure was a distraction from holiness, that the flesh was a problem to be managed, that desire was a stain on devotion. That separation, that hard, anxious, guilt-soaked line between sacred and sensual, between holy and human, is a much later invention. It arrived with specific theological traditions in the late Roman period, hardened under medieval monastic discipline, calcified under Victorian morality, and got baked into the textbooks that taught you temples were quiet, clean, marble white, and boring. Your textbook gave you the columns. It left out the incense, the drums, the sweat, the gas seeping through limestone, the taste of barley wine in a rough clay cup, the woman handing it to you at 2 a.m. with coal on her eyes and a knowing look. So the next time you see a temple in a documentary, all clean columns, reverent silence, a narrator whispering about spiritual devotion over drone footage, you know better now. You know there was a baseline. There was myrrh and wine, and a priestess breathing sweet gas off a fault line in the rock. There was a king in a cedar bed, and a whole city watching the grain grow. There was a dancer in sheer linen, keeping time with a bronze sistrum, her ankles wrapped in gold. There was a boy carving his name into a sandstone wall next to a picture you'd never show your grandmother. There was a woman pulling thorns through her tongue and calling it prayer. All of it was holy. All of it was human. And someone, somewhere between the 4th century and the 19th, decided you weren't ready to know that. You were. You always were. If this rewired how you picture the ancient world, hit follow. The archive has more doors like this one, and they all open into rooms your school never showed you. And down in the comments, tell me which temple you'd walk into at 2 in the morning, and what you'd want to find waiting inside. Because I guarantee, it's not what they taught you in 6th grade.